Good evening. I'm Kevin Freeman. Welcome to York History Group. And today is Tuesday, October 26, 2021. Tonight, Danny Bottino and myself are going to finish. No, we're not going to finish. We're going to continue talking about religion in early York, complexity and conflict, part 3. So if you've missed the previous segments of this, you can go over to YouTube and you can find it there. The name of our YouTube group is York History Maine. So you can find there's 3 segments with Danny there. There's other segments with Danny and I talking with James, and some of my co-administrators, Kevin McKinney and Wayne Wood, are also in conversations that you can find over there. So I want to thank Danny, especially for all this work that he's done to provide us with all this information on York's early history and religion, and how this is all transformed and sort of evolved. And I find it to be a very fascinating topic myself, and I'm really looking forward tonight to continuing this with you, Danny. So welcome, and let's get started. Danny has actually been on a trip. He's been to another country, and he's been doing research there. He's just going to give us a little quick, brief excerpt of what he has done.
Yes, definitely. Hello, welcome everyone. Glad to be back. Certainly, yes. I've been back from London, England, since the 16th. So I've been back for about a week now. So certainly feels a little bit shorter. I left for the trip on the 6th, I believe. Yes, and I came back on the 16th. So it was a rather quick trip. Primary purpose was to find primary source documents for my PhD history work. So I can tell you a little bit about that. I believe in part 1 of our series, actually, I tried to summarize briefly, although when I'm talking about my PhD, hard for me to be brief. I believe I summarized it back in part 1. So I won't do that a second time here. But I can tell you about the documents I looked at were mainly legal documents from the 1630s at the earliest. I believe I looked all the way up through the reign of Charles II in the 1670s. And what these documents was England had a central court system by the 1600s. It started actually earlier in the mid 1500s. And what the central court would do was they would send officers and legal men out to the countryside, to every single county in the whole country. And they would send these men in case there was a local legal conflict, usually having to do with generally oral custom. With conflict over land, conflict over payment of various, rent on land or certain customs, which were usually oral, or if they had been written down, sometimes there were multiple versions or the document couldn't be found or so on. So there'd be various conflicts over customs, right, over the rights that these customs gave to various people. And the court would send officers to the countryside to listen to everyone who wanted to talk to them about all the issues and all the sides. And what you would have then is you have in these documents that I looked at, I have witness general statements given to the court, and they would be written down as the voice of these people. So there's hundreds of ordinary, we can call them, English people, women and men also. We have gentlemen, but we also have lower status people, farmers, laborers, various types, who are not present in any other source, right? This is beyond their birth record and their death record. We have their actual words. And these people are talking about the landscape that they live in, for the most part. They're talking about the customs that they know, that they were raised in. And they're talking about memories that they have also. And sometimes they just talk about random things. The court wrote down everything that they said. So you get snippets of various cultural, sort of aspects of culture that we wouldn't get otherwise. And these sources will be a central part of my PhD. I was going to get them last summer. I was planning to go in the summer of 2020, and COVID stopped that. So I was able to make the trip, this year. So I photographed probably around 500 documents. I would say so. For the most part, now I actually have to read through them. If I read through the documents while I was there, I wouldn't have been able to get through maybe like 10. So you have to photograph them and then read them later.
Wow, that sounds great. So they were in their own dialect. So do you think that the court sort of embellished what they were saying, or did they clean it up at all? Or?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think that the courts would have added anything or taken anything out, even, although that would have been easier to do. Certainly, people would have had regional accents, regional ways of speaking, and when you read these documents, they're all in standard English of the period, 17th century. So I would think that when the court wrote them down, they probably changed certain words that would have been regional or wouldn't have been widely known, or certain accents. They would have changed it into the standard London English spoken. But beyond that, I don't think there were too many changes. Of course, it's difficult to prove, but that's what I think. Yeah.
Wow, that sounds awesome. So some of this is going to go into your PhD thesis.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
Definitely.
I'm looking forward. I hope that becomes public and we can all read that, Danny. I'm looking forward to it. I just noticed that Kevin McKinney wrote on Facebook that no power over on his side of town. So that's like over near the York River. But I also want to tell people that if you have any questions, we are monitoring Facebook here, and you can type a message in right below where you're watching the video if you want to ask Danny any questions or anything. And also, if you want to, we can't really see evidently how many people are watching or who you are. Earlier when we started this, I could see who was watching. Now I can't see that. Facebook has changed it, I guess. So if you type in that you are watching and where you're from, that would be great. Then we'll get to know who our audience is a little bit. And if we don't have an audience, well, that's okay too. So Danny, I'm going to do a quick little review of where we left off last time, not too long. And then Danny's got a PowerPoint presentation that he's going to share with us. So you want to get started on that review, Danny?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yes. So would you like me to try to summarize what we've been talking about in the last two videos?
Well, one of the highlights for me was the more colorful aspect of Reverend Burdett. We didn't really start there, but it was kind of like pretty extraordinary, and his relation with Georges, Richard Georges,
Thomas
Georges, yeah. And what that really, to me, what it meant for quickly we can say that Burdett was a very colorful figure that was fraternizing with mostly the women, I guess, of York, and he was in court several times, and you can look up the court documents and you can see that. And then he was removed, and he went elsewhere.
Vanished.
Yeah.
Yes. I believe he went to Dover, and then he went back to England. Yes.
Yeah, and never heard from him again. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So I think that what Danny and I have been doing with this series is really trying to discuss the evolution of religion from Lutheranism to Calvinism to Puritanism, and what it meant in different places, and what it meant. It meant something different, perhaps even from Massachusetts to York, even though York was part of Massachusetts at the time. There was a different type of people here living. They weren't religious zealots necessarily. They were sort of like people that just kind of wanted to get out into the countryside and maybe go to church on Sunday, but not like uphold the law of God to the extent where they became zealots, I guess.
Yeah, you could definitely say that. Yes, and you certainly see that with even more notably in the early period, as we talked about. You have the Puritan takeover, as I think we can best term it, starting in the 1650s, which goes back and forth. But the Bay colony to the south, the mostly Puritan, more radical, more radically Calvinist colony takes fully over Maine by the time the George's heirs sell Maine in 1678. And you can see Thomas George's in the 1640s is a moderate Calvinist Puritan, we could call him, in that he is part of that faction, the Puritan faction within the English Protestant Church. He does fight for Parliament in the Civil War, but yet he writes from York about what's going on in the southern Puritan colonies, and he talks about how in his letters that he writes back home, he talks about how they have changed the law, and he is legally trained. So this is what he's very sensitive to this. They have changed their law in the colony from standard common law, the standard English common law, to biblical law, in that their stated goal, and this didn't last very, very long because it wasn't possible to do and people weren't happy with it. The stated goal was to have biblical law, was to have all their laws based on the Bible, scripture, and so to throw out any English law that you couldn't trace to the Bible. And Thomas Georges writes about this, and you can, I won't talk about it too long here, but you can read about how he's thinking about this, and he says that he says in one passage that when the Jewish laws were created, they lived in a very different culture from the English culture of the 1640s, and that their laws were meant for that time and those Hebrew people, and not for current English people. And he's not happy about it. And he writes this. So you can see how there are factions between the more zealous, more radical, we could call them, the more radical Puritans than the more moderate Puritans. And Maine is certainly of the more moderate type. Yes.
Yeah.
In the early.
Yeah. So it's curious that just happened. And Danny and I just talked before we came in the air a little bit, and Danny will start with his presentation in just a moment, but about a lot of these people were trained at the same divinity schools, Harvard particularly if you were in the US or America, or Turtle Island, and Oxford and Cambridge. But then they came to these outlier towns, these frontier places, and they evidently would just preach a different sermon.
Right. So you have Harvard was founded in 1636, and the first ministers, stretching through the 1650s, 1660s, first ministers go to English colleges, Oxford being the most prominent, Cambridge too. Trinity, of course, is also the third one. Not as prominent as the other two. But you have periods, and it's very complicated. I read a book about this a couple of years ago. You have periods in which the faculty of different factions are more prominent at these colleges. And so if you graduate in a certain year, that meant you were tutored, and you were allied with certain faculty who were more radical. And then if you graduate a couple of years later, people who taught you were less radical. So you can look at the different people graduating in different years, and you could sort of guess how they would have been formed. But by the 1650s, 1660s, Harvard starts graduating its first people who are now taking over parishes. I believe Shubal Dummer went to Harvard, so he would have probably been York's first Harvard educated minister, though may have been earlier ones. I'll have to check Banks for that. There is, and Banks goes into this pretty well. He sums up all that was known at the time that he wrote in the 1930s. I don't think anything has been found out since. From the time, from the 1640s through to Shubal Dummer's coming to York as their permanent minister in the mid-1660s, York has quite a few ministers. I believe York has about 5 ministers. Banks has a brief bio on each of these men. And York is trying to get ministers to come and to stay permanently. And some of these men do stay for, some of them stay for only a couple of weeks. Some of them do stay for, a year or 2 years at the most, I think. But they never want to be permanent, so they always leave, and they don't leave really much of a general legacy in York.
Yeah.
Dummer is York's first minister that really, really matters for the culture of York. It's the first time that the York people can say, this is our permanent minister.
Yeah.
And so really the line of York's ministers starts with Dummer, and then Samuel Moody, who takes over after Dummer's death.
Yeah. And Danny, it's occurred to me also that each one of these ministers
Yes.
brings their own coloration with them.
Yes.
Dummer seemed like a very complacent, just really good-natured person, kind.
Yes.
And then we look at Samuel Moody, a little bit more fervent and more agitated, maybe, but evidently is very much liked by the townspeople.
Right. So, and this is sort of a complicated issue, because with Dummer, although he was here from the mid 1660s until he died in the Ray of 1692, so he was here for quite a long time, we don't really know too much about him personally. He certainly signed a lot of property deeds, so you see his name in the records from the time very shortly after he became minister here. He signs his first deed, and he signed deeds through the 1670s, 1680s, which shows he was a prominent member of the town.
Yeah.
So in some of these deeds, he's buying land, but in some of the other ones, he's just a general witness to the deed. And so witnesses to these deeds would be people that you were close friends with or close kin to, that you would want to witness this deed. This is a critical role, since the point of witnessing a deed would be to back up that deed if it came into conflict or if there was some argument over it. Yeah. So you'd want someone that you really trusted. Yeah. And Dummer shows up quite often. So it shows that he was I think that evidence shows that he was generally a well-liked person, as well as having close kin ties in the town too. Now, about him personally, though, about what his personal life was like, about what his manner was like, there's not much to know. As far as I know, we don't have any personal letters that he wrote, and we don't have any sermons, right? So for Samuel Moody and for his son Joseph Moody, we have sermons. We have pages, thousands of actual words that these people spoke to York. Yeah. For Dummer, we don't have anything.
Undeniable evidence, so you could call it.
Right.
Yeah. And now, so Danny's going to start his PowerPoint presentation, but I just want to tell people that Banks' History of York is a quintessential. You must have this book if you want to be able to research what Danny's talking about tonight. And there's 2 volumes, and unfortunately they're out of print, but fortunately you can find them on the internet if you type in History of York, Banks, and either one. And they were published originally by the Old York Historical Society, and I've been told that they're recently out of print. But if you want to buy a copy of the book, you might be able to find one at like Abe's or some used bookseller also. So Danny, thanks for that quick review, and let's start with your PowerPoint presentation.
All right. Yeah, we can get to my PowerPoint now. My PowerPoint starts with talking about the Salem witch trials and their link to York, which of course hinges on Dummer's death in 1692, which I'm almost at. So let me just tell you one anecdote about Dummer, and then we'll get to that.
And yes. Also, so we don't really have I kind of read parallel to what Danny's going to talk about, and then I interject all these questions, so I throw them off track probably. But also another thing that is interesting to me are the two churches down, one in the Meeting House Pond, and then the other one up by Clark Road, and then to where it's moved. So we're sort of in that time frame, but now we're going to jump ahead a little bit to the Salem witch trials, which is very appropriate for today. Today, it's like, I think there's a northeaster out there. The wind is blowing crazy. People in the village don't have electricity, so we hope they get it restored soon. And here we go.
All right. Yes. And I do want, prior to, to Dummer's death, prior to killing him off here, I do want to give, and Banks does talk about this. So as far as I can tell, this is the one really, truly personal glimpse into Dummer's life. There is a Quaker sort of book of what happened to the Quakers, various Quaker groups as they were traveling. And they did visit York and Kittery, I believe, in the 1660s. And the Quakers had only been formed really in the 1650s. So they were a very new group, and they were a very radical group. They came from the same Calvinism that the ordinary Puritan also sprung from. But Quakers were quite different in that they had different practices. So they, first of all, did not think that there should be a settled minister in a parish. They believed that anyone who had the Holy Ghost could preach. Women also, which was very radical. And they, in their early years, they were not they did not have their peace only doctrine, in that there was certainly argument within the early Quakers about whether they should use violent means to take over government, or to have a more godly government. And so they were feared and they were hated by most people within England and within the Boston, by the Boston colonists, certainly. And they, I could talk more about Quakers in the early years, but we'll just talk about how they came to York and to Kittery. And they met with York's minister at the time. So the minister prior to Dummer was a man named Emerson, John Emerson. And the Quakers note that he came to their meeting, and his wife came too, and he was very anti-Quaker, and he was not happy that they were in his town. And he came with his Bible, and he instantly opened his Bible up and started pointing out scripture that he said directly proved Quakers wrong on various points. And the Quakers would answer him, then he would say, no, you were completely wrong, and he wouldn't even listen to them. He would just keep quoting scripture to them. And so the general view that the Quakers had of him was very negative. And after Emerson left York, he wasn't at York for very long. Banks actually speculates that due to this perhaps somewhat rigidly Puritan nature, the more moderate people of York didn't like him, and so that's the reason why he didn't stay long. Now you have Dummer coming after that, and Dummer goes to a Quaker meeting also, and the Quakers write that he was quite different. They write that he came in, and he, as the Quakers were speaking during their meeting, he didn't say anything. He just listened for the whole meeting. And at the end of the meeting, he did stand up, and he did say clearly why he thought that his doctrine differed from what they had been saying and from general Quaker doctrine. But he didn't. In the way that the Quakers wrote, he wasn't angry. He stated plainly how he thought that he differed from them, and he parted from them in a somewhat friendly manner. And so you can see there that I believe that this shows that Dummer was the more moderate Puritan faction that people of York and of Maine in general were more amiable towards, rather than the more radical Boston type Puritans.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Danny,
Beyond that, we don't know much about Dummer, but we do have that.
yeah. That's great. And part of that is in Banks, like you said, Danny.
Mhm.
And I
Yep.
noticed we do have some people watching tonight, so that's nice.
Excellent. Excellent.
We have some comments.
All right. Very good.
Yeah. Marcia, hi Marcia. She says wonderful program. She's from Algonquin. Elaine and Roger are watching. Wood.
Oh, yes.
Kevin, I believe, is there too. So howdy, everybody.
Yay.
So yeah, so there's so much, Danny, there's so much, because every like couple of paragraphs, I want to ask you more questions. So I gotta stop thinking that way.
Well, ask any question you want. Yeah.
Well, but we're not gonna make much progress. So I'm
No.
just gonna be quiet and let you start that presentation.
All right. So let's move on to Dummer's death in the 1692 raid. And let me open my PowerPoint here then. So share screen. I should note that it's been a couple years since I read about Quaker theology and the early Quaker movement. So I am sorry if I was vague and didn't,
Yeah, were they
get as many
somewhat, were they transient,
details about
or were they transient, or did they just
as far as I can tell, they were moving around, right?
So they could be like hired help or something?
Yes. Am I sharing my PowerPoint screen? Do you see it?
How you have it? Yes. Important scholarship on early modern
Yes.
witchcraft. Yes.
All right. So let me get that into a slideshow. Yeah, early Quaker theology was quite radical and was quite detailed. And so I wish I could tell you more about that, but I don't have it at the forefront of my brain currently. But it's quite a fascinating subject. But let's get to the Salem witch trials and York's role in them, which is quite a major topic. So I thought that the best way to get into this would be to just give a brief couple-minute overview of when we talk about witch trials like those that happened at Salem in 692. Although in many ways the Salem trials differ from the ordinary or other witch trials throughout the period, they still are part of this general overview, this general history of witchcraft and witch trials in the early modern period. Early modern being a term generally used for about 1450 to about 1750, I would say. And that's the period in which witch trials really flourish. So prior to about 1450, 1400, you certainly have within Europe and the rest of the world really too, but culture of what a witch is and what it means to be a witch and to practice that type of magic is present in almost every single culture throughout the world and throughout world history too. Although it does differ in certain ways, obviously, in many ways, the way that it doesn't differ is quite fascinating. But for our purposes, we'll be focusing upon Western Europe here, which is what I have studied. And within Western Europe, you have this general culture of the fact that witches are real and that magic in the supernatural world is real in general. But for various reasons, which have been much argued about and very controversial for the last 100 years, really, there were no major witch trials and there were no burnings or court-ordered deaths of witches on any scale until about 1400. And it is then in Switzerland really is where it starts. You have the first early modern witch trials in which you have people who are thought to be witches are for the first time found legally, that's found legally to be a crime, and they are legally brought to trial and then found guilty and then punished by being burned at the stake, usually. And this takes off in the 1400s and spreads from Switzerland throughout Europe. It goes. You have witch trials in Spain, France, England, Germany, and throughout Eastern Europe, also Italy too. In some areas, there are more trials than others. In some countries, there are more. For instance, I would say France and Germany, modern day France and Germany, those areas were split into various into different they had different borders in the 1500s, but those were the areas where there were the most witch trials and the most people found guilty and the most people killed. And whereas in Spain, England, Italy, there were certainly trials also, but they were on a much smaller scale. Now, the estimate for the whole period from about 1450, 1400, with the first trials until the final trials in the late 1700s, the estimate is about 40 to 50,000 people were killed.
Wow.
Many more people tried. Probably hundreds of thousands of people tried, and about 40 to 50,000 people killed throughout this period, mostly in Germany and modern day France, modern day Germany. Within England, you have the first witch trials in the 1500s, and that's where they reach their height. And they are really starting to die off in terms of numbers, really, by the early 1600s. So the Salem trials of 1692 are in many ways the end, the last gasp. And on this page here, there's been quite a few, I'd say probably thousands of books, some of which are excellent, some of which are pretty rather bad, most of which are just excellent, are just pretty good, sometimes a little bit dry. So I have put 4 books here talking about Europe and witch trials and witchcraft in general in Europe in the 1400s through the 1700 period. And these 4 books, I think, offer the best overview for trying to understand what witchcraft was and what happened during these witch trials. And the Norman Cohn book here, the second one down in the Europe section, it's probably the one to start out if you want to grow your knowledge on this topic. I would start with that book since he was the first, I think, still the best scholar to try to analyze the origins. So why did these trials happen? Why did they start up when they did in the 1400s? Why not earlier is the big question. He argues that the same primal urges and the same hatreds, really, that you see directed towards witches were directed towards earlier groups of people in Europe. And you have the movement towards the new category of witches in the 1400s is something new, but the type of hatred that is given to them is something very old. So he argues that the hatred of the Jewish people in Europe from in the 1300s, 1200s earlier, you have the same marks that are given to witches. So you have Christians in Europe in the 1200s or 1300s blaming Jews for spreading plague. You have them blaming Jews for eating babies and for killing children. And you have them blaming Jews for having wild sexual parties. And all of these same accusations are leveled at witches starting in the 1400s. So you can see these are, Cone argues, primal hatreds. These are the worst things that you can say about people. These are the worst possible crimes within the human psyche. And witches just become the sort of created target for them by the 1400s. And beyond Jews, also there are other earlier groups that he argues that these labels were stuck onto. You have Christians in the early church. You have Templar Knights also are given these same crimes in the 1300s, and so on. So I'll stop there about Europe and get to the Salem trials. So the Salem trials, in many ways, are simply this culture of witch hunting brought from Europe over here. And I have a list of various articles and books which I think are the best on the Salem trials. And what I'll be talking about today is the link of these trials to the conflict, to the war that was being fought at the same time in the same place. You have the English colonists are locked in a bitter and violent war, a world war, you could call it, known as the 9 Years' War. Generally, it lasted nine years from 1688 to 1697, and it pitted France and France's allies on one side versus Britain and Britain's allies. And in this corner of the world, the native people of Maine were France's allies. And so you have native forces allied with French forces threatening the English towns, mostly near on the border where where France's colonies were to the north, England's colonies to the south. Maine is the front line. The French claimed territory down to the Kennebec River, and they authorized the native forces in Maine to strike any English town that they could in order to gain victory. And so you have by 1692, most of Maine's English towns have been raided and have been given up. The English people have just left. And York, Kittery, and Wells are basically the only English towns left by 1692.
Andy, can I ask a question?
Yes, I will pause. Yes, question.
So were France's other allies Catholic as well?
Right. So Jesuit priests had been going and traveling, living with the native peoples of Maine and throughout Canada also, from very early on, from the early 1600s. And so by the 1680s, 1690s, most of Maine's native people would be formally Catholic, we could call them. Many of them claimed to be Catholic. And certainly that was part of the reason why the English feared them so much. For the English, of course, when the English first came to settle in these areas, the native people were not Catholic. They were following their own pre-contact spiritual doctrines. And for the English, it's quite fascinating within the way that they write. For the English, this was a better situation for them than when they became Catholic, or at least formally Catholic later. And so you have this as a spiritual conflict, because you have not just native and French forces bearing down on English towns. You have overall Catholic forces, Catholic spiritual war being waged on Protestant England. And that is the core of the conflict. And that is, as many of these authors in this list argue. So you have Emerson, Tad Baker is very prominent, and of course James also, both of whom live in this town, and both of whom have argued that the Salem witch trials must be seen within the context of this spiritual war, in which English colonists throughout the area see the war not just as being physical, but being as a war between good Protestant Christians and Catholics who are not even Christian, right?
So was conversion the goal?
Mhm.
Were the natives and the French
Yeah.
trying to convert the people in York to Catholicism?
Well, certainly, yes. That's a good question. Certainly, you see that happening when captives are taken, and in the York raid, about 100 maximum, I would say, captives were taken. It's difficult to find the correct numbers, and they were taken to Canada. And the young children, I mean, everyone was offered the option to join the Catholic Church. And for many of the young children who were raised there, they did become Catholic, and they became Catholic nuns often too. And this didn't just happen with the York captives in 692. It happened from captives throughout the whole period from all these raids. So this was certainly a part of the strategy of the natives and the French. And this was noted by the English, is that their captives were becoming Catholic, and often saying they didn't want to come back to their Protestant English towns, which was quite shocking. That was probably worse than death for the English, to have a captive say, that he or she was free to come back but chose not to, which happened quite often. And the French would always say that this person is totally free to go back to their town, but they choose not to. I think when the French said that, they were smiling.
But typically they were offered a bounty, weren't they? Offered a bounty for release, so they declined that.
Right. Yes, definitely. Yeah. And the bounty would go to the French captors. Yeah. So the French turned the bounty down. Yes.
Oh, wow. Hey, Danny, one little nuance in here that you talked about to me one time.
Definitely.
Was in Nantucket, the Puritans actually invited Native Americans to form their own churches.
Definitely.
And that wasn't happening. Was that happened so far north, but it didn't go obviously into what we now call Maine.
Right. Yes. You see, the strategy, the sort of Protestant missionary strategy, works much better in certain areas than in other areas. In fact, right, it works, as makes sense, and certainly as made sense to the French. Also, it worked best when these Protestant missionaries said, "We're not going to challenge your culture. We're not going to make you speak English. We're not going to move you to certain settled towns," which in most cases, those were what missionaries tried to do first. The thought was, people cannot become Christians if they're not English first. And so that strategy usually failed, because it just alienated people. And it also made it seem like being Christian was too difficult if you had to give up your culture also. So there were missionaries who realized that strategy wasn't working. Within the early Maine English towns, I don't think much effort was given to sending missions to the native peoples. You don't see missionaries working. You don't see too many English missionaries, or even I don't know of any who came up to Maine. Samuel Moody certainly is worried about the Jesuit priests working within the native peoples. And in one instance, in 17 teens, he offers to send his only son, Joseph Moody, who was a teenager at that time, to live with a certain native, a very powerful native man, whose name was Bombazine, right? Um, and if he would send his son to York so that Samuel Moody could raise him as a Protestant Christian, and he was turned down. Samuel Moody was bummed. He said, "No, I'm not gonna do this because I already am Christian." It's interesting that I am a Catholic Christian. It's interesting that Samuel Moody is noted as saying, "I will raise his son as a Christian." So this means he doesn't recognize Catholics as being Christian.
Yeah.
And right, so there are certainly Samuel Moody and other ministers in Maine probably certainly were very anxious about Jesuit priests in Maine, and the fact that most of the native peoples in Maine did not want to be Protestant, but there wasn't much that they were really doing about it. They weren't capable of doing much. But they were very anxious about it, and part of that is what led to the Salem witch trials. So yeah, I would just point out Tad's books here. I got two of Tad's two books that he wrote. One of them is specifically on the Salem trials, and then his earlier book focuses on a lesser known witch trial case in the 1680s in the modern day Portsmouth area. Newcastle, actually, yes. And then you have various other books about Salem, which if anyone has any question about, I can certainly talk about, but I do want to get on to the specific details of what happened at the trials. So let's go on to Dummer's death and the raid, and what that can tell us about what happened at the trials. And as I mentioned, so Dummer was killed in the raid on York in 1692. And he had been minister for almost 30 years at that point. And his death was very much noted as soon as the news of the York raid reached Boston and the other towns. And so we see this man here, Floyd, Captain Floyd, who was in charge of the closest horse troop, which was in Portsmouth. We should have been garrisoned in York probably, but for some reason they were in Portsmouth, and so we're not able to aid the town. When it was raided on January 25th, Floyd comes up to York the next day and he writes this letter back. And I quote it. It's a very long, detailed letter. It's fascinating. It tells us quite a bit about what we do know about what happened during the raid. He tells us he buried 48 people. He tells us there were three garrisons left. There were hundreds of people in these garrisons. They must have been very packed, and many other fascinating details. But he writes that Dummer was killed, and so he says that Dummer was stripped. His clothes were taken from him. He was his body was mangled, and his wife and his family were taken captive, and they died actually on the march north. So they were never ransomed. His wife and his children. At least one child, the youngest child, was taken captive, and that child died, as well as his wife Lydia. And so he says that there is a famine not just of bread in the town, but of hearing God's word. And so Dummer was the first English minister to be killed by hostile forces in the English colony's history. And so this raid on York was seen in Dummer's death. As Floyd writes here, the word of God has left York. So it's seen as a spiritual loss, seen as the devil winning a major victory here. And this meant that within all of Maine, there was only one English pastor left, who was in Wells, who was a man named George Burroughs, right? Burroughs. who will be a major character in the story because he ends up dying in the same year as his colleague Dummer, because he is hanged as an actual witch and as the leader of the witch faction, as it's seen by the Salem judges. And the reason, as James and Tad and other scholars have argued, is because in Dummer's death, the question is asked, why was Burroughs not killed? Why was he spared? Why is he the only minister left? Burroughs had been at Casco Bay in 1690, completely wiped out also. And he was the minister there, and he was not killed or taken captive. Then he goes to Wales. And he was in King Philip's War earlier in the 1670s, I believe, also at Casco when it was raided. So he was seen by 1692 as, for some reason, not being killed, whereas of course Dummer was. And so this was seen as reason to think that he was in league with Satan.
Wow. These were really dark times.
Yes. Oh, yes. People were very anxious, right? So some of what I'm talking about may not seem logical, right? And certainly even in the years, in the 1690s, when people were looking back on the 1692 and the witch hunt, people were already realizing that people were not acting logically, were not acting rationally. But the war had been going on for 4 years. Almost all the English towns in Maine had been wiped out. York had just been, had just been burned down. So people English people were very anxious. It looked like the war was being lost. It looked like Salem and Boston could be threatened next. And so that's why James, and so our friend James, was the first scholar to put forward this view, which I've been trying to summarize here, which is that the raid on York and the war in Maine and throughout the region in general was the primary cause of the trials, and that the trials in the form that they happened could not have happened without them. And so that's what James said in his article here, which published 1984. And I put article is over 30 pages, so it's quite a bit to quite a bit in there.
Yeah. So the Candlemas
so
Massacre.
One quote out.
Did the Candlemas Massacre occur before the gist of the witchcraft trials?
Right. So let's get the timeline here. Right. Yeah. So massacre, or the raid, as I call it. Massacre is a word that is used, right, when you want to demonize the other side. And it makes it seem as if what was carried out was not an act of war. And what happened at York was the way that the war was being fought. And even at the time, in the 1600s, 1700s, massacre is not used. Raid is used, because even though the English in York suffered and they were very, they recognized this was a terrible blow, they knew that this was how the war was fought, so they didn't call it. They didn't call it massacre. It's fascinating, actually. They called it raid. And then in the 1800s and later, then you start people calling it massacre.
Well, thank you for that clarification.
Interesting. Yeah. Didn't want to. Sorry. Yeah, didn't want to harshly correct you there.
No, it's great. No, it's always good to learn something. And local lore has it that it was called the massacre, and the memorial says Candlemas Massacre.
Yes, it does. Yes.
So maybe we should think about making some changes.
I do think that monument, some of the wording on it is not accurate, as I talk about in my walking tour. Yeah. I think that monument could be changed. Yes. in the wording. And yes, so so what we have is that James argues in this quote here, this is sort of summing up quote in the paper. He says that the witch hunt was a product of the Williams War, is what it's called in this theater. As I mentioned, it's the 9 Years' War is the worldwide war, and the theater here is named after the English monarch at the time, who was William the Third. And of course, his coming to power was a primary cause of the war, as he was a Protestant Dutchman who overthrew the English Catholic monarch James. And that was the reason why France went to war, as they claimed, to put the rightful Catholic monarch back on the English throne. So you can see the Protestant Catholic conflict at the core of this war. And James says that the witch hunt was a product of the war. Now, village factionalism within Salem was split into 2 different regions, and this was seen as the primary cause of the trials up until James's article in the 1980s. And he says that yes, there was factionalism. I have talked to him on this subject too. And he says, yes, there was factionalism, but that could be said about most towns. York certainly had factionalism too. And so you had the minister at Salem Parish here, who was a very angry man. We can tell from his sermons, and he was very angry about the fact that there was a faction in Salem Village which did not like him and which wanted to fire him, basically. And so he preached about these enemies in their midst, and he may have meant, his enemies on the town council, but he was probably, I think, hinting at larger enemies, the fact that Satan was working with these people. And so James argues that the young girls who started the Salem witch trials, basically by saying if someone was cursing them in January of 1692. So they started acting strangely about the same time that the news of the York raid reached them in late January 1692. So it's not clear whether they started maybe a few weeks earlier, but even if they did, it's certainly very probable that once the news of the raid reached them and of Dummer's death reached them, then their fears and their worries that the forces of Satan were at work would have been really ratcheted up, because now Satan's forces had just raided York. They were threatening Salem. And so it made sense to them that the devil's secret agents, witches, would be within Salem at that very moment, getting the way ready for his soldiers to come down and conquer Salem.
Did a lot of people leave York after the raid?
Yes. Well, actually, no. I mean, the people left York were the people who were killed or taken captive.
Yeah.
But about half the town who was left, probably about 150 people, wanted to leave York, but they were ordered not to, because the government realized, rightly, that if York was given up, as towns to the north, such as Casco, had been, then that would leave the way open for towns to the south, like Salem, to be raided. And so the garrisons were kept at York, but it was very tenuous. Yeah. And that wouldn't have been known in January or February either in Salem. And so you have these young servants, mostly girls, but some boys also, as well as some older women. But it's mostly young girls who start thinking that they've been cursed, and start saying that they've been cursed by various witches. And so how James thinks about this is that this was not, as was often claimed, this was not the girls faking it. This was not them for their own various devious motives, perhaps being told to by their parents to say, oh, this rival in the town is cursing you, so you should say that, and then we'll get him or her tried as a witch and then hanged. But rather, this was a real fear, and these young people were absolutely certain that they were being cursed, and they the tension of the war was the primary factor in that certainty. And of course, I think a clinching factor is that there were orphans from Maine within this group of girls in Salem, and there were also people. Most of this group would have known or had kinship ties to people in Maine who had lost family in the war, who had fled from towns that had been raided in the war. You have people from Casco, whose family had been killed in the raid on Casco in 1690. Burroughs had been minister, as I mentioned there. These people would have known Burroughs, and they would have known that he wasn't killed. And of course, Burroughs had 3 wives also, and this factors into when he's called down for trial. You have the girls and various people who knew him earlier saying not only is he an evil witch, but he is also, through witchcraft, he has also murdered his 2 previous wives, which may have been true, so it's possible. And this happens in the cases of other witches who were, so-called witches who were tried, that there were other accusations brought up which may have been true of these people, most notably the prominent male witches who are tried and then hanged, of which I believe there are 5 or 6 men. Off to check that. These are prominent men in the town. Burroughs, of course, went to Harvard, and they are in the trials. They are said to have treated their servants very poorly, and these same servants are calling them out as witches. And they have, and of course, Burroughs said to have actually murdered people too. So it may be that real crimes made it into the accusations of witchcraft. Of course, there was a guy, what's his name, who wrote a book in the 60s, Chadwick Hansen, that's his name, who said that people in Salem were actually practicing or trying to practice magic, and that they were actually practicing the witchcraft that they were said to be doing at the trial. And he has some evidence, but and it's it's certainly not a terrible book, but I think for the most part, from my reading, and James thinks this too. I've talked to him. I talked to him on it. He's, put it simply, he's wrong. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't realize how interrelated all of this was. You've really helped elucidate that in my mind. I'm kind of blown away by, the connection.
A lot.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It's such a
Quite a bit. Yeah. And I've just scratched the surface here. There is we're 20 people who 19 people hanged at Salem, and then Giles Corey was then pressed to death, and then about 5 or so people died in prison waiting for trial also. So about 25 people died due to the Salem witch trials, and each of these people and everyone else who was tried, of which there were hundreds, has a different story, and there's different contexts and different factors which play into all of this.
Yeah,
very complicated. Yes.
Yeah,
very complicated.
I had a great 7th grade grandmother that was called to court, and then she was exonerated at the last moment by the governor, and she escaped. She lived in Gloucester.
Yeah. Oh yeah. This as I mentioned, you have victims, people hanged from Maine. Burroughs was from Wells,
Yeah.
and um, the trials really should be known as the Essex County witch trials, rather than the what they're normally known as. And that there were people were mostly at the trials were drawn not just from Salem, but from a wide range of Essex County towns, such as Gloucester,
Danny,
and Boston too. Yeah.
I have a
Yes.
question in regards to, so some of these towns are well known to us. One that's not particularly known to me, but I noticed a lot of people were coming from there is Newbury, Mass.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's up the Merrimack. That's up the Merrimack from Newburyport, and
yeah.
It was a port town. What was the draw for so many luminaries to come from there?
I don't really know, too much about Newbury. I do know Samuel Moody. That's where he was born, and his wife also, Hannah Sewell, were both from that town. Then they came to York 1697. Moody's, I believe there had been a relative of Moody who had been in York in the very earliest period. So that's probably one of the reasons why he came up to York. But Newbury certainly would have had a close tie to York, definitely. I think this Samuel Moody coming to York is evidence of that. Most of the Essex County towns would have had close ties to the main towns. In the York deeds, which I've been studying for my PhD, if there are people buying land or other entering other legal deed-like instruments, if they're not from Maine towns, and they're almost always from Essex County towns. They're from Portsmouth, Dover, and Essex County towns. And from Boston. Beyond that, they're not from. There's hardly anyone else. So that is the world that the settlers of modern day southern Maine lived in. That was what they were tied into.
And who would want to come north? Anyways, who would want to come to York?
Right. Yes. Most people didn't. Yes.
Yeah. So it took a while to replace Dummer.
That's right. Yeah. Well, you have sort of interim minister who takes over for Dummer by 1694, and his name is John Hancock, actually, right? With a famous name. He is the grandfather of the more famous owner of his name, became governor of Mass in the 1780s, I think. Is his famous name signature, yes. And so, yes, the grandfather, he came to York in 1694, and Banks has a page on him. I believe that's all that we know about him. He went on to become a famous minister in a different town. I forgot which town it was, but he left York after a couple of years. He started probably as a garrison chaplain. He was sent up as a chaplain for the people still in the garrisons. And then eventually he left by 1695, 1696 to have a more comfortable parish than York, which must have been tough in York in the years after the raid. And then Samuel Moody comes to York 1697. And he graduated from Harvard in around that same time. So he comes to York right after that. He's born in 1676. And he marries his wife Hannah Sewell in 1698. And Hannah Sewell, also should be noted, is the niece of Samuel Sewell, who is from Boston, a Boston merchant. And he is one of the witch trial judges in 1692. So you have that link to the trials there through Hannah Sewell. And Sewell is a fascinating character because he is the only judge. He's the youngest judge, I believe. He certainly lives longer than any of the other judges. He dies 1730. And he's the only judge to publicly say that he was sorry for the actions of the witch court. He does this in the 1690s, so soon after the trials. And he talks about this in his very detailed diary, which he kept. And that's also why he's notable. He kept a very detailed diary from 1670s through his death in 1730, which we still have that diary. And he writes that his family, after the trials, were suffering as some of his children died. Things were going very poorly for him. He saw these as signs of God's wrath. These were providence. This was providence. This wasn't just the natural world. This was the supernatural actions. Yeah. And so he saw himself being punished and his family being punished for his role. And so he goes to a church and he has his minister, Samuel Willard, who was, during the trials, he was one of the anti-witch trial ministers, we could call them. Cotton Mather was the most pro-witch trial minister. Willard, I would say, was probably the most anti-witch trial minister. He was not happy with what was happening, and he publicly spoke about it. And so he reads Samuel Sewall's statement, and Sewall writes about this in his diary. He gives a statement in his diary, actually. And basically he says, I'll have to check this. But I believe he says that he is confident that the devil was at Salem, but there were no witches. The devil caused everyone to think that there were witches, right? Yeah. So they were right about there being, the devil being present at Salem, but he, of course, tricked them. And so that's what Sewall says. And I think Samuel Moody and Hannah Sewall, they definitely would have known about that. Samuel Sewall often visited York. And in Joseph Moody's diary, son of Samuel Moody, he writes about Samuel Sewall coming to York in the 1720s. So he would have been a well-known presence, I think, in York. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, there's a little tangent there about Sewall, but I think that's a further interesting link to the Salem trials.
Yeah, and so did he start kind of like a whole new movement of consciousness, do you think, in the United States?
Well, Sewall, maybe, yeah. Yeah, I mean, he also wrote the first major anti-African slavery pamphlet, right? In 1700. It's called The Bondage of Joseph, I think, or I something along those lines. So he published that in 1700, and he is not in favor of African people being held in terms of bondage that doesn't end, right? Yeah. And this is the big change that's happening. The form of slavery, as it becomes prominent in the colonies and then in the newly formed country in the 1700s, 1800s, is being created in this period in which African people, for the first time, are being seen by the governing forces, not just in the Bay Colony, but throughout the British colonies, as the only people who can be put into bondage without any limit. And so this modern slavery really is starting to be formed in this period, and Sewall is not happy about it, and so he publishes this pamphlet. So he's a fascinating character.
Yeah, he was pretty progressive.
Yeah, yes, yeah. Definitely. He was in many ways a very old school radical Calvinist. You can see this in his diary. He's not happy about how sort of Puritanism is dying out. So he doesn't wear wigs like Cotton Mather has a very long flowing wig of the late 17th century. Yeah. Sewall said that was not godly, right? So he wore a black cap. So in some ways, he's a throwback to
Yeah.
the settlers of the earliest period in the 1630s, but yet in some ways he's very modern looking.
Yeah.
So he is a sort of a fascinating glimpse
Huh.
into the changing attitudes of the period.
Yeah.
I would say.
I just I want to back up for a second because kind of
Yes,
still hooked on this thing about Puritanism, and we're
definitely.
going to go way back to Godfrey because I think it's
Yes.
relevant to our conversation. And in Banks, I did find a quote from Godfrey when his land was taken from him after the submission, and
Yeah.
which isn't that far back. But so if you don't know Godfrey, I know you know, Danny, but other people with you know, Godfrey's land was taken, and the Puritans came up from Massachusetts. They sort of said, okay, we're going to apply our laws to your land, and you kind of have to give all the land back, or you have to use it the way that we use land, and we're not going to honor all of the old deeds or whatever. So there was kind of like a land grab. And Godfrey, the founder of the town of York, then had probably built the first house in York and lived down by what's now near the Wiggly Bridge in that little cove area near the mill pond. Godfrey wrote this about Puritanism, and I thought this was kind of exceptional. They subjugate all other patents and make them townships. We that first ventured must petition our sometime servants to be good to their master's children. What law can we have or expect that be of the Church of England? They independents, so are antagonists, incompetent judges being parties in action and opposite in religion.
Yes,
so just for him to say opposite in religion is pretty insightful, I think.
Yeah. Yes. And he wrote that was in the 1652, right? Or
yeah,
in that period. Yeah. The civil war in Britain had just ended, and the last battles were fought in 1651. So King had been killed by radical Puritans in 1649. So you can see why feelings would have been very high. You can see why Godfrey would be so angry.
But he also goes to the point of making it like his religion is almost like antithetical to theirs.
Yep.
And that's that distinction that I'm still kind of looking at. But I don't know if we're gonna actually have time tonight
We might not.
to go into Moody's sermons, because then we start to see this whole another darkness come over the town, I think.
Yes.
So okay, so we probably should close up here pretty soon, but we don't really have a reason to, other than maybe I should go home and get dinner. Oh yeah, we've been going for about an hour and almost a half.
Yeah, I think this is a good ending point, because we're at the point where we can start talking in the next section about Samuel Moody and about Joseph Moody, his son, and about their sermons. And it's going to be different from Dummer because we actually have their sermons, and Joseph, we have his personal diary, which he wanted to keep private too. And we've got some other sources too. So we know quite a bit about them. And I'll be talking about that in the next segment. Yeah.
All right. So we'll wrap it up now. And I also, Danny, I want to mention to people, and we're going to do a little promo on your history group about you're doing a talk at Massachusetts Historical Society on Patience, Boston, with Hannah Peterson. And you want to say a little bit about that before we end?
Yeah, I mean, it's coming up on November 9th. So it's a purely it's going to be a purely digital, purely virtual. So you can go to their site, just click on the link, and I think it's free actually. And then they'll send you our paper that we wrote, and then there'll be a Zoom. And I won't give too many spoilers here, but our paper does look at the 38-page narrative of Patience Boston and her time during, which primarily focuses on her spiritual journey in York's prison from 1734 until she was hanged for supposedly murdering a eight-year-old boy in Falmouth. And she claimed that she murdered this boy, and there were no witnesses to the crime. So all we have is her word that she did it. And she pled guilty, and she was found guilty by the court when the court came to York in 1735. So she was waiting for the court to come to York, and that's why she was in prison for that time. She was pregnant during that time too, also, and she gave birth in the prison. So even if she had been found guilty earlier, she wouldn't have been hanged until she had given birth. So that's the factual background. And what we try to do in this paper is to look at the spiritual language of this narrative, which was edited and published by Samuel and his son Joseph in 1738. And we try to understand what's going on in this document, which is a very complicated document. And of course, the question is, how much can we trust the truth of this document? And so what we've tried to do is to say, we can never know for certain whether this is completely Patience's words or how much we're seeing of her life through the lens of Joseph Moody and his son Samuel. So what we've done is we've said the best way to look at it is to try to understand as much as we can about these three people who are the three authors of this document, of this text. So we've tried to understand the text through a very detailed look at everything that we can know about the possible motives in crafting this document of Patience Boston and Samuel Moody and Joseph Moody.
Yeah. Wow.
So that's what we'll be talking about. Yes.
These are some heavy topics, Danny.
Yeah.
Once we get finished with religion in Europe, we're going to need to do something that's fun.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, it can be pretty grim, but we can talk about the Yorks, the first people going to the beach in York in the 1870s,
yeah.
summer tourists and so on.
Yeah,
talk about that.
Yeah, okay. So thank you, Danny Bottino. It's been great having you on, and we're going to be looking forward to segment 4. I'm looking forward to doing a little rough outline with you on that and polishing up and reading Banks, more Banks. Actually, yeah, I wonder if Banks talks about any fun topics.
Maybe.
Yeah, I haven't found any yet. I can't think of any off my head. All right, so thanks everybody for joining us. It's been great, and we'll catch you next time. And Danny, you're going to hold on for a second.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.